Hello, podcast listeners. You've stumbled upon JJ Meets World, and this episode is number 50 in our chain link of amazing podcasts. Rebecca Larson is our guest. She runs another podcast called The Tudors Dynasty. Boy, oh boy, you're going to get the history of the Tudors. You're going to get her personal opinions. You're even going to get a sneak preview at the book she is working on right here, right now. Boy, oh boy, you're going to enjoy that. Plus, Tucker and I talk about the important things that you find in gift shops. All of this and more on today's episode of JJ Meets World.
1, 2, 3, 4. J.J. Gordon, sort of like that Indiana Jones, in that he's always sniffing out his next adventure. Yes, he is. He's always interviewing guests so he can have them on his show and they can talk about pop culture, arts, and leisure. J.J. has his flag unfurled and he likes his french fries curled, and he's fun and then he twirled as he goes to meet the world. He will march into the rain even if his ankle sprained. Take a peek inside his brain. This podcast is called JJ Meets World.
When I went to Europe for the first time ever, I went on a school trip, and I took French, and so there are some French students, and then there's some Latin students from North High. Shout out to Mr. Volk from North High, who is
Mr. Volk, yeah.
one of the most amazing educators I've ever met.
Fantastic teacher, fantastic guy.
And our group wasn't big enough, so when we got to Rome, we met up with other schools that didn't have huge classes coming so that we could fill an entire bus. And there are some kids from Texas and then some kids from Mississippi. One of the stops on this tour that went through Italy into southern France was we stopped at the Vatican. And here's something you don't know about the Vatican unless you've been there specifically to one of their gift shops. You can pick up anything from their gift shops and they'll have it blessed by a cardinal and then delivered to your hotel later that day.
Huh.
And it's a service that they provide. It's just like Disney World. You can buy anything you want in Disney World and they'll have it shipped to your room for you. No sweat.
Was this like when your dad would have a rabbi come in to Dakota Kid sunflower seeds?
Right.
To bless it?
Yep, to bless it.
Make it kosher?
20 seconds so that it could be kosher certified. So one of the things you could purchase at these gift stores were rosary beads, handmade rosary beads from the papal rose garden. And I mean, how amazing is that, right? Your actual rosary beads made from roses. And so they smelled amazing and they were delicate and they weren't even as expensive as you would think. So I remember some kids bought rosary beads. And later that night, I ran into one of the kids from Mississippi, and they were headed out into the town. And we weren't allowed a lot of like just solo time in the town, but there was enough. And we were also, do not drink. Well, come on. It's legal for you to drink. You're going to go drink.
Yeah.
So one of the kids from Mississippi is super excited and shows me that the thing that he purchased at the Vatican that he had a cardinal bless was a shot glass. That said the Vatican Rome on it, and I
for
said
wine only.
So you got a shot glass, and he goes, yeah, we all did, including their teacher that we called the dragon, by the way. So I'm looking at this, like, you bought a shot glass, and then I thought to myself, the shot glass really is the universal gift shop item. It doesn't matter where you are, there are going to be shot glasses for sale in a gift shop. And I've noticed that.
Also magnets with a lot of people's names.
Yeah, but that's not universal, though. I will say this. Like, when I was in Europe, I did not see any of those. I saw some things that said, like hello. And I imagine that's how they're saying it. Postcards are also universal. If you're in the United States, it is a magnet with the name. I bet you never found a Tucker.
Never found a Tucker.
My sister's boyfriend, Brady, there's no Brady out there.
Really?
Which is shocking.
That surprises me.
And
actually.
so I look all the time.
Yeah.
And I've only found one Brady, but I had to have it specially made.
Do you find a JJ?
Once.
Wow.
Yeah. But it was Jay.
Oh.
And I was like, oh, come on. So Are we cheapening our experience with history
Absolutely.
when we do things like have shot glasses?
Well, anything that's a gift shop, if it has a gift shop, it's not going to be. It's really just for this is how they make the money to get the tourists, get something out of the tourists. Come see our dead popes, and then come buy a shot glass or this deck of playing cards that have all the popes commemorated on them.
I've got a 6 of I've got the John Paul of Hearts.
There is something about a gift that you can use to drink from that I think actually is always a good gift. Like anytime I'm just given a free mug or a free water bottle or even a free shot glass, I'm like, sweet, it has a use. It's easy to store. It will always be useful unless I break it.
Right. It's not going to run out of ink like a pen.
Yeah. Do you remember what's the movie where John Travolta's basically Jesus, I think? Not Michael, but there's another one. It came sort of after Powder came out, and he's like the special guy with.
Like Phenomenon.
Maybe that's what it was. Yeah.
Right.
And so I believe there's a line where there's a scene where someone's going, "Oh, what did he give? He gave you chairs?" And she was like, "Yeah, I'm glad that he made me chairs. He made me something that I can sit in and rest in and stuff. If he'd given me flowers, I would have just put them in a vase, and they would have died within a few days." So giving someone a gift that has utility, I think, is always a good way to go.
I love a good practical gift.
Yeah.
But most people don't really see that as a great thing. I've given plenty of gifts where people go like, "Oh, thanks." Be like, "Bro, remember you were telling me that your car is making a clunking noise. You put this solution in the tank and it'll get rid of that clunking noise."
That means they were thinking about you. Mm-hmm. You were on their mind.
Versus somebody who says like, "Hey, good news. I got you this book that you're never going to read by an author you've never heard of."
Can we go back to rosary beads for a second?
Yeah.
So you kind of blew my mind a little bit, which it shouldn't be because I was raised Catholic. I'm from a Catholic family. Mm-hmm. So I'm used to rosary beads, but I've never thought about where the beads come from. Are you saying that you can get a bead out of a rose?
So what you do is you take the petal of the rose and you wrap it, and you keep wrapping them around, and so it's each one is made by a piece of art where there's like,
that's like a petal.
Yeah, well, maybe it's a flowers, and it could be an entire rose's worth of petals wrapped to create this cylindrical or circular bead.
Okay, I did not know that. I just assumed that it was just a bead and that the term rosary came from something else. But hey, I learned something today.
You learn something new every day.
Which is kind of what this episode of JJ Meets World focuses on, right?
It really is. By the way, how do you use rosary beads is one of the first things. Is it disrespectful to wear rosary beads? So let me just pull this up real quick. This is from Wikipedia. In the sense of crown of roses or garland of roses, also known as the Dominican rosary, refers to a form of prayer used in the Catholic Church and to a string of knots or beads used to count the component prayers. Mm-hmm. When used for the prayer, the word is usually capitalized. Oh, God, it goes on forever and ever and ever. The standard 15 mysteries of the rosary. That's another podcast right there. But you do make a good point, Tucker.
Thank you.
This podcast is special for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's one of the first times we've had a guest who also has a podcast. Of course, I think our first guest who had another podcast was Randy Kay.
Yep.
But Rebecca has an insanely popular podcast, and it has to do with a royal family and with intrigue and with duckies. Those will make sense. That reference will make sense in a couple minutes here. I think you guys are really going to enjoy this. It's a deep dive. Even if you don't know anything about the Tudors, I think you're going to get interested in what's going on. And Showtime should just be cutting her checks because I think she's bringing people over to watch the Tudors, even though that series is completed.
Yeah. Another reason why this episode is special is it's episode 50! 5 times 10, 50.
Can you believe we made it to episode 50?
I'm surprised we made it to episode 5.
Technically, that means we've been doing this for 25 weeks.
Yep. We started in the beginning of April.
Holy smokes.
4,000 downloads later, and we're still here producing 2 new episodes every week, I forget what the math was, but I think we're close to 60 or 70 hours worth of podcast content.
You've been listening to us for that long.
Yeah.
Don't you have better things to do with your day?
Yeah. Once you're done listening to this podcast, you should check out the Tudor Dynasty podcast and get a couple downloads there.
Yeah. Tudors Dynasty. Do you think the show Duck Dynasty, it just shares just the word dynasty, right?
Yeah.
That's it? There's
The
no similarities?
Only thing that's the same.
Okay. Why are we putting more time in front of us? Let's not. Speed bumps are gone. Rebecca Larson is our guest. She has a podcast, and you're going to learn all about the Tudors. So tell your kids not to listen to this one. Might get a little racy with sex.
JJ Meets World.
Hello, Rebecca Larson. Welcome to our podcast.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
This, I think, is the first time we've had someone on who also has a podcast, especially a podcast that's insanely more popular than ours.
By orders of magnitude.
Yes.
Wow.
So we're excited to have you on. I met you through the place that you used to work that I currently work at.
Right.
I don't really throw the call letters out that much because I imagine eventually someday somebody's going to come to me and say, like, you can't do this anymore.
LGHP.
Yeah.
That's the place.
That you like that? I like that. That's some good moves.
I'm not even sure I trust my alphabet recall there, but we're just going to say it's good.
There you go. So let's get into this thing right off the bat. You've got a podcast called Tudors Dynasty.
I do.
And it's about the Tudors.
Yeah.
So the TV show, the people, what is your podcast about?
It started out probably mostly about women from that time period. So I talk a lot about what made them unique, why they were fearless, stuff like that, and then kind of went back to the beginning, when the dynasty began, how it began, how things changed, all of Henry VIII's wives. I could do a 10-year podcast just on his wives.
Which, that is what's fascinating to me, that you chose a subject that I would think would have a finite amount of content, but there is something fresh all the time. When I was talking to you about this and you said, oh, yeah, I do this podcast, and you're so nonchalant about it, I went home and I immediately downloaded a couple episodes, and my sister was a huge fan of the television show The Tudors, and I said, Chrissy, you need to listen to this because it's going to be able to expand your knowledge, and I think you get a richer enjoyment of, because the Tudors are pretty popular right now. They're having a moment.
They have been, I want to say, probably for at least the last 4 years. Mm-hmm. And I think the TV show, The Tudors, had a lot to do with it. And I think that came out in like 2007. And that really piqued a lot of interest for people on, ooh, what's this all about? Who are these people? They really existed. What are their stories? And that's what kind of got me into it as well, wanting to know more and doing research. And I read a lot, so I was reading a lot of historical fiction and wanting to know what the real story was.
My grandmother used to read dime store novels about lovers.
Harlequin romance novels.
Oh, I used to read
And
those too.
She told me that she doesn't read them for the hanky-panky, as she said. She reads them for the history.
That's like saying you look at Playboy for the
Yeah.
articles.
Sure.
I read them for the hanky-panky.
So let's start with this. What do you think? What? Who are the Tudors? If somebody is listening to this for the first time ever and they're busy downloading your podcast as well right now, who are the Tudors?
The best way for me to describe who they are is usually by starting with Henry VIII. When somebody looks at me and they're like, the Tudors, who's that? I usually say, well, Henry VIII. And then everybody knows, oh, and then the first response is, oh, he's the one that had a bunch of wives and killed a bunch of them, right? And I go, well, he had 6 wives and executed 2, but I mean, that's neither here nor there. But I usually start with that, and then I'll backtrack. If they're interested, I'll backtrack a little bit to his father, Henry VII, and how Henry VII came to the throne was by defeating Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with Richard III, but just a few years ago, they found his remains in a car park in Leicester.
Huge. That was huge.
Yeah.
That was crazy. And that was really interesting to me because I also love history. I love thinking about it. And oftentimes we we think in this modern world that most of the physical discoveries have probably happened, right? But no, that's not true. I mean, centuries of human building over old things that they never thought to preserve. So to think that you'd find this very famous monarch buried in a parking lot.
It's crazy.
Nuts.
It's crazy. And speaking of that, right now there's a big battle over saving the Battle of Bosworth land, the field where it took place. It's this huge historic place. And there's a battle over saving it because they want to build some type of racetrack or testing track there for cars or something to that. Honestly, I haven't read enough about it, but I know
something that obviously doesn't matter to you.
Right. And there's a lot of historians and authors out there in England who are fighting against this, going, you're going to destroy history by doing this. And I respect that fight so much because here, especially in Fargo, we don't have all that history. So to live in a place where you have it, you should respect it.
I have friends who have a house on the golf course in Prairie Wood. And they put this big vegetable garden in years and years and years ago. And while they're tilling up the land, they found spoons and forks and like chunks of metal plates. And their neighbor said, "Oh, we've been finding that garbage for years." And so it had been
so cool.
Yeah,
it's so cool.
It obviously had been a place where some people had chose to settle, and for whatever reason they abandoned these things, or maybe they were all eaten by wolves. You don't know, and the metal is all that is left here. But to think like, oh, it's just garbage, or oh, this thing happened, but we've already talked about it for 500 years.
There's
we
books.
Don't need to worry about it. Keeping history preserved is definitely going to be a challenge coming on, especially as we want more space as human beings.
Right.
I think that's one of the drives of human beings is just give me some more space. I want people close, but I need space.
Yes.
And so they're building bigger parking lots, and towns are moving further and further and further out in the suburbs. And before you know it, there's going to be a point of where it's like, well, where this mini golf course now stands used to be, a castle.
Right. Yeah, and that makes me sad. We need to preserve history, and that's what I'm hoping I'm doing, in a sense, is helping to spread the word, to tell these stories of these people who really existed. They aren't just characters in a history book or in a book. These were real people who had real lives, who went through some horrible things.
Such as, give us some little Tudors 101 here.
Okay, so let's, probably the most well-known person from the Tudor period's Anne Boleyn, who was Henry VIII's second wife. He set aside his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, who they were married for over 2 decades. She, unfortunately, was only able to give him a living daughter. And because the Tudor Dynasty was so new, they really needed male heirs to keep going. At that time, Salic laws, they didn't believe in women being queens, queen regnants. So she was unable to provide him with a living son. He then found a way out of the marriage by saying, well, you were married to my brother before this. Obviously, we went against nature and God by getting married since you were married to him and you consummated the relationship. And even though they had a papal dispensation to make it okay, he still found a way like, okay, my advisors, I need you to go out and take care of this for me. And it took a long time because I think he started wooing Anne Boleyn, they say like 1526, 1527. And it wasn't until 1530. Oh my gosh, now I'm going to totally get like 1532, 1533 when they finally got married.
Right. And wooing back then isn't what it is today. There was no texting children.
No, he sent her letters. We have copies of his letters that he sent her. And, romancing her, saying things like, he wants to touch her pretty duckies. Which duckies
that is
meant
so amazing.
Her chest.
I will forever now refer to any man or woman's chest as their duckies. That is so good. That is so good. Our language has really suffered in the past 30 years because we're losing all these great terms.
Yes, yes.
Duckies. Oh, that's so good.
So he wrote her a lot of letters. We don't have any copies of her responses, more than likely because after she was executed, they destroyed everything that represented her portraits, letters, anything.
They were trying to erase her from history,
Pretty
more
much,
or less, right?
But it ended up making her one of the most well-known figures in history. So they got married. She gave birth to a daughter who later became Queen Elizabeth I, Gloriana. And unfortunately, he became a little dismayed with her. She was a little probably more vocal than he wanted a wife to be, whereas his first queen...
So pretty much just saying anything.
Yeah, pretty
right,
much.
at that time?
And arguing with him in public and stuff like that. So there was always conversations about them having arguments. People could hear them having arguments, but then they would make up fantastically, if you know what I mean. They would always talk about that. So they had a very fiery relationship, but she was very intelligent. I mean, she spent a lot of time in France, which was very common at the time for young women to be sent to live in households to learn a little bit more about life, to learn how other things work.
Where did she come from originally?
She's English. She originally came from Kent. She was born in Blickling Hall, but most people know her best for Hever. She, grew up at Hever.
Was she from a family that was well-to-do?
Oh, okay. Her mother, I would say, was probably more well-known than her father. Her mother came from the Norfolk line, which were very well-known family in England, very wealthy. So she was also a descendant of Edward III, like many of his queens. But she wasn't a princess by any means. They would have considered her probably a commoner back then, kind of like Diana. She was an aristocrat, but considered a commoner.
And so it must have been sort of scandalous that he takes Anne Boleyn as a bride. So not only has he gotten out of his first marriage, right? Which, by the way, the kings of England, well done, because you seem to be the ones to figure out how to get out of marriages better than anybody else.
Yeah. Just got to be king. That's all it takes.
But then I imagine there were other people, there was probably pressure, especially with a new dynasty like that, to maybe marry somebody from a more aristocratic family or heck, maybe even another country.
Right. It was more common to marry outside the country. His first wife was Spanish. Her parents were Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella, who was a powerhouse when it came to being a queen. She ruled in her own right. Her father, Ferdinand of Aragon, ruled in his own right. So she came from a very powerful family, whereas Anne Boleyn was, hey, I'm a country girl.
She was hot.
But she wasn't. That was the
wasn't.
thing. No, she was never described as a great beauty.
Oh.
So it was her personality and her intellect that he was really attracted to at the time.
And now at this time too, I mean, I believe I'm recalling this correctly, that now with our knowledge of genetics and how that works, that he was trying to get a son and was going, how come these women aren't giving me a son? Isn't it more likely that it was because of his own DNA, his inability to pass on the Y chromosome, that probably would have been the reason why getting a son was so difficult?
Yeah, they talk about a disease called Kell's syndrome, I believe it's called, and it has something to do with the chromosomes and how his wives were able to give him generally one living child. And so if that first living child was a daughter, they weren't able to produce another one.
Wow.
So it wasn't until his third wife that he was able to finally get a son.
How does Henry VIII become somebody that we have a song about? I'm Henry VIII, I am.
It's so incorrect too, by the way.
Is it really? Okay, so we can shed some light on that. But how is he remembered in this way, other than just being like, this guy was off of his rocker, more or less?
It's all the number of times that he married.
Just that, huh?
Honestly, and the fact that two of his wives were executed. One of them was more than likely guilty of something, whereas the other one wasn't. So Anne Boleyn wasn't necessarily guilty of adultery or incest as she was charged. Those were just charges that were trumped up against her, to make her look bad and to make the English people turn against her. Whereas his fifth wife, Catherine Howard, who, by the way, was a cousin of Anne Boleyn, she, had premarital sex, and it wasn't brought to his attention before she married him, which was like a big no-no, because when you marry the king, you better be a virgin. So when she was executed, it seemed more fair, might be the right way to say it, because she actually did do things that were seen as unseemly for the time.
It's a good thing I'm not trying to marry a king. I would have gotten ousted right away.
And what is the connection with this in the Church of England?
So when he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn is when the Church of England was created, so that he could marry her.
So maybe that's a big part of why we all know him too, is I don't know if anyone else who, to get divorced, started a religion that he could then get divorced in.
Right.
And my knowledge of the Tudors comes from the TV show.
Okay.
So obviously correct me where I get it wrong, but that show also established that once this new Church of England came around, and that there was actually a lot of religious persecution that happened then in the countryside because he wanted to remarry. Right?
Could you imagine, you are raised Catholic your entire life, and suddenly now your country is a reformed country leaning towards the Protestant ways, and they want to take away things like, praying to statues in church, or, I think like the Eucharist might have been part of it too, or going to Mass. I don't know as much about that part.
All of your traditions.
Right, are gone. And if you practice them, you're a heretic. So that's what happened to a lot of people. And then Henry was like, hey, I want you to sign this form here that says, I am the head of the Church of England. And I also want you to sign this form that says, Anne Boleyn is my wife and all of our heirs will be heirs to the throne. And there were people like Thomas More, who later became a saint, basically, for becoming, he was a martyr, who was a great friend of Henry VIII. Henry grew up with him. They used to stargaze together and have lots of talks together. And he refused to accept Henry as the head of the church because to him it was the Pope. How could you do this? The Pope is the head of the church. I can't sign this. And ultimately it cost him his life.
That is... See, so this is why you've got so much to talk about on Tudors Dynasty.
Endless.
Yeah.
It really is.
Well, I really sure hope Jill's able to give you a son. Otherwise, I'm gonna get worried that I'm gonna be in trouble eventually. I think that's the direction this is going.
I hope that I'm able to squire a son is really the worry here. I'm gonna see if my HMO covers Kell's syndrome as part of this. So Anne Boleyn gives him a daughter.
Yes.
How quickly after she gives birth to a daughter is she out the door?
It's about 3 years. So Elizabeth was born September 7th, 1533. So we just recently celebrated the anniversary of her birthday. And it was May 19th, 1536 when Anne Boleyn was executed. So she really only ruled for about 3 years. That's why they have the movie Anne of 1,000 Days. That's in honor of basically how many days that she actually served.
What about how was she executed?
Oh, well, I was going to say she was lucky, but, most of them at the time, if they were going to be executed by beheading, it was done with an axe, which could be a sloppy situation. There are some stories where it took 6 or 7 blows to remove somebody's head. And the first few times they hit him in the shoulder or what, how awful. So when she was convicted, it was Henry VIII's choice to either burn her alive or have her beheaded. And thankfully, he said, we'll do it by beheading. And he called for an executioner from France to come in and do it by sword. So much faster.
One of the most interesting scenes from the Tudors is when...
sad.
It's sad, but when you hear from the executioner a little bit, this is his job.
Right.
And he's like, this is how I do it. I fake out the person by calling to someone to bring me my sword.
Right.
They look to that person, and then I swing while they're looking away, and it'll happen so quickly. I just thought that was so interesting that there's this man who, this is what I do.
Right.
I lop the heads off of people.
Yeah.
And I've done it so much and I've got a reputation of being quick and clean, that here is my methodology. And it just kills you when the actual moment is happening.
They did such a great job in that show. The real history, she was actually blindfolded. So she wasn't looking around, but they were still concerned about her moving and him missing. But the part that blows my mind is the fact that the person that was going to be executed would pay the executioner. They would hand them a purse of coins before their death. And the executioner would always, ask for their forgiveness beforehand, which they would grant. And they were always just so stoic up there when they're... on the scaffold about to die, and they say these heart-wrenching speeches, and you read them years later and you go, how in the world were you able to get all of that out without saying anything awful about the king who just had you executed? Like, she had to worry about her daughter. You know, she had a daughter who was going to grow up after this, and if she said anything bad, God only knows what would have happened to her.
So is her daughter and Henry VIII present for her execution?
No. Elizabeth
Thank God.
Elizabeth at the time was about 3 years old, and Henry VIII was busy with his soon-to-be third wife at the time. So the story goes, he was waiting for the bell to toll to tell him that his second wife was dead, and then, proposed.
What a
to,
piece of garbage.
I know. And part of me really likes him. Like, he wasn't just this guy that executed his wives. He did a lot for the Royal Navy. He built a lot of castles and buildings, and these are the things that people don't talk about when it comes to Henry VIII. So I've done a couple podcasts about understanding Henry VIII because I feel like he deserves it a little bit. Imagine if somebody 100 years from now wrote a play about you, JJ, and all it was about was all the awful things you ever did in your life.
That would suck.
Right?
It would be good, but it would suck.
It would be entertaining.
But when he was doing all those things, when he was building castles and growing the Navy, was his motivation, from what we can understand of it, that this is for the good of the country, or was he legacy building like a pharaoh from Egypt who's like, I want you to build a statue of me and do all these things because then I'll be around forever? Was that what he was doing, or was he actually a good monarch in those methods?
I think it was for selfish reasons. He would always talk about Henry V and the Battle of Agincourt and how he wanted to be known for being this great warlike king who won all these battles. And in all reality, he won the Battle of the Spurs in 1513 while his wife, Catherine of Aragon, was back in England killing the Scottish king when he wasn't there. And it's like he tried. He really wanted to do this, but I don't think it was meant to be. His father tried so hard to keep the country at peace after 30 plus years of the Wars of the Roses, cousins fighting each other, murder and death, and, just constant killing. So when he came to the throne, he was like, I want peace. And then his son comes to the throne at, 17, 18 years old and wants to create this image of him being this all-powerful, warlike king. And it didn't quite work out that way.
Did you ever see the Man of Steel, the latest Superman movie that came out?
I love Henry Cavill.
Okay, so you saw Man of Steel?
I'm a DC fan.
Okay, that's fine. I mean, maybe
finally
someday
found out what
they'll
I don't
get it
like
right.
about you.
I know. I'm sorry. I'm one of the rare ones.
I actually do love DC as well. It's the DC movies I'm not big in, but that's a whole other podcast. That's a whole other thing.
I would say the current DC movies because
Yeah.
I enjoyed the
Absolutely.
Tim Burton Batman. I like the Christopher Reeves.
Absolutely.
Anyway,
100%.
so what I'm kind of taking from this is at the end of that movie, spoiler alert, by the way, if you haven't seen that movie yet, come on, you're never gonna. But there's that moment where Superman and General Zod they've had this huge battle and buildings have fallen and the terraform machine is turning, Earth into the new Krypton. And Zod looks at him and he says, I am programmed to do one thing. My whole life is about ensuring the Kryptonian race to go on. And if I need to take out a weaker species to do so, I will, because the only goal in my entire life is to ensure our survival. And then Superman breaks his neck, which, by the way, that was a little anticlimactic to me. That's all you had to do.
Very non-Superman thing to do.
But really,
I'll kill this guy.
And my problem with that is I ended up identifying with General Zod and being like, well, he's trying to do what he's supposed to do, right? But that's kind of what Henry VIII is doing too. He's trying to ensure the survival of his family as the ruling family in England.
Right.
And so, here I am a minute ago, I was like, what piece of garbage, right? But he had to make some tough choices.
Right.
And he had that must have been a tough life. And even if he's doing things selfishly, it's selfish for his family, right? So he wants to ensure his legacy, but part of his legacy is continuing on their dynasty.
Exactly. I mean, he was competing with the Plantagenet dynasty, which was 300 years long prior to the Tudor dynasty. So he's looking at that. Those are some of his ancestors going, well, I need to do something that's just as great. And unfortunately, the Tudors only lasted from 1485 to 1603. And then after that, the Stuarts came over. But that's a whole nother story.
Did they have any confrontations with the Habsburg dynasty?
Oh, Charles V.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was like, where you're going with that.
Well, no, actually, the reason, it's not really Charles, but the reason I brought it up was I actually hadn't heard of them until the news recently, because the lobbying group that Paul Manafort started in overseas when he was working for the Russian-backed Ukrainian leader was called the Habsburg Group. And they named it after the Habsburg dynasty, the Habsburg family, which was basically a family that was essentially in power in Austria for 200 years, give or take. And that timeline, I just looked at it and I was like, yeah, it did match over with the Tudor dynasty a little bit. But so I guess the question then is, what sort of family rivalries did the Tudors have that we maybe haven't heard about? Families whose names are gone from most history that maybe you would know about that they would have been dealing with?
That's a tough question. You really threw me a curve. I mean, the Habsburgs, that was a big deal too. And I don't know if you're familiar, either of you, but his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, Charles V was her nephew.
Okay.
So when Henry broke from Rome, there was a real fear that they were going to come over. They were going to send an army and try and invade England as punishment for what was happening.
Okay.
But other than that, I mean, the French, but everybody knows. Who knows anything about I'm like, everybody knows. Well, maybe not everybody, but.
So we've got a little history on the Tudors here now. So when did you start getting into the ins and outs of this? By the way, your recollection of dates is amazing. I was trying to think of what my birthday was there for a second.
I've checked what today is 4 times.
Yep, right?
I've always been a numbers person. I've always been really good at numbers. So
good for you. Good for you. There need to be some of you out there so that there can be some of us out there.
Right. And I have a thing for faces too. So if I see you once, I'll always remember your face. I might not remember your name, but I'll know your face. But anyway, I forgot what the question was.
When did you first start getting into this?
Okay. My passion before the Tudors was genealogy. And when I was pregnant with my son in 2003, that's when I really started wanting to know more about my family history. I had known bits and pieces about it prior to that. I've always been obsessed with family history books, reading them, looking at dates, places of birth, any cool stories from newspapers. So when I was pregnant with my son, that's when I started diving in a little bit more, doing more research, trying to figure it out. Ancestry.com is my favorite website for genealogy stuff. They give you the little hints. You can add people to your tree. And that's kind of what happened is I started working on my mom's side of the family, started attaching little pieces here and there to the tree. And suddenly I found a connection to Margaret Tudor, who is Henry VIII's older sister. And she was later Queen of Scotland, Queen Consort. She was married to James IV. And when I found that, it was a few years later that the Tudors came out on Showtime. So I thought, this is really cool. These are my people. And then I went back to my family tree research and realized that those hints that I had found were incorrect. And so that just blew up the entire thing. But I had already found the passion for the Tudors. It was there. I already wanted to learn more. And so I just kind of went with it from there and started reading a lot of books, a lot of historical fiction. That really.
So when you read something like historical fiction, how can you wade the fact from the fiction?
Sure.
Isn't that tough? Because at this point you have a scholar's knowledge of the Tudors, but at the same time you've also probably read some pretty risque things on those pages. I mean, let's face it, huh? Well, I'm winking.
When I first started reading historical fiction, it was Philippa Gregory. And
my sister loves her.
And her historical fiction people really tear apart because she took a lot of liberty. But when I read it, I just read it for the fun of it because back then I didn't really understand what was real and what wasn't. So I would read these books and then I would go and research it all to find out what the truth was. Unfortunately, nowadays, a lot of people take that as fact. They read it and go, well, this is true because I read it in this book. Well, no. There are things that we don't know that happened, and that's what historical fiction is. They fill in the gaps where we don't know and make it entertaining. So when I first started, it was reading it for the entertainment, but then also doing my research to back it up. And then a few years later, I started kind of diving into the nonfiction stuff a little bit more to really learn. And it's harder to read the nonfiction because it's, of course, not as entertaining. So you really have to find something that interests you.
It's usually not told like a story. It's oftentimes just more of a list of facts.
Yeah, like a textbook.
Yeah.
Which can be a little bit difficult sometimes.
And I think is I don't want to go on too much of a tangent here, but the way that we teach history to kids, I think just misses the mark so much because it's, usually dates and places and names and remember this and remember that. And you never, at least in my experience, didn't really get an illustration of thinking of, Henry VIII as a actual person who existed on this planet, was walking around flesh and blood. These things happened. And trying to put yourself in the mind of someone who existed at that period of time, who doesn't know what electricity is.
Right.
Doesn't know what internet is.
Never had a microwave.
Bathes maybe once a month unless they're wealthy, maybe. And it's probably in a crick, right?
Right.
So I haven't listened to a ton of your podcast yet, but what do you do in your show that you think helps you sort of successfully paint the picture of that time period that makes your show so popular?
I really try to make them real. To me, that's the biggest thing, turning them into real people and making them relatable to us. One of my favorite female characters, per se, from that time is Mary Howard. She was the Duchess of Richmond and Somerset. She married Henry VIII's illegitimate yet acknowledged son, Henry Fitzroy. And of course, it wasn't her choice to marry him. She was, put into this marriage. He unfortunately died like a year later or something like that. They never consummated the relationship because they were too young. And she was promised a bunch of things when he passed away that she didn't get. And she fought back. And I respect her so much for that time, for a woman to stand up for herself and talk back to the king, talk back to her father. Her father was the Duke of Norfolk, and his name was Thomas Howard, and he once said that she was too wise for a woman. Right?
Boy.
Right. So there are things like that just inspire me. And I go, oh, hang on. We need to tell her story because she stood up for herself. She was like, no, I'm not going to remarry until I get what was promised to me. I was told I was going to get this and this and this, and I've yet to get it. Father, you need to go talk to the king and tell the king I'm owed this. And her father wasn't doing it for her. So she tried, to get an audience with the king to do it herself. And she lived a long life. She never remarried, but that...
Good for Mary Howard.
Did she get her stuff?
Eventually.
Okay,
yes.
awesome.
Yeah,
good for her.
Yeah. So I really I respect her a whole lot. And I don't know if you guys know this or not, but I'm in the middle of writing my very first book.
Oh,
that's
cool.
very cool.
So I'm working on, right now I'm going to call it historical fiction, on a lesser known character of the time, but a character who I feel like deserves to have a voice. And it's hard to write books about female from this time period because there's nothing.
recorded.
Of course, men were the end all. So I chose Thomas Seymour. He was Baron Seymour of Sudeley and Lord High Admiral. And he was sister to Henry VIII's third Queen, Jane Seymour. He was brother to her.
It would be like, whoa, twist.
right. Whoa, this is getting interesting now. And if you watch The Tudors, he had a very minor role in this series, and most of it was made up, and it really makes me mad when I go back and watch it now and go, none of that happens, but okay, whatever. It was, for the sake of drama. But he's another one who has one of those stories that history has kind of just ran with because some people said some negative things about him. And I really identify with him because he was a middle child. I'm a middle child. He liked to get attention. I have a podcast, obviously. I like to get attention. But he made some bad choices. And so, like I said earlier, JJ, if everybody looked back at all the bad things that you did, well, of course, the picture is going to look pretty bleak. So for
Why
Thomas...
do you keep coming back to me being a horrible person?
Sorry.
Or at least having like these 5 horrible things that would make it interesting play. What do you know, Rebecca? Anyway, keep going. I'm sorry. I cut you off.
So Thomas is the younger of 2 of Jane Seymour's brothers at court. She has 3 brothers, but he's the youngest of 2 who are actually at court. His older brother, of course, is going to inherit everything from his father once he dies. Thomas isn't promised anything because he's like the 4th son, 3rd living son. And so when his sister becomes queen, his family's status begins to rise. His sister gives birth to Henry VIII's only surviving male heir, Edward VI, who he later becomes. And so Thomas and his older brother, Edward, of course, start seeing some elevation. Thomas, unfortunately, doesn't elevate as high as his brother, Edward, because he's the younger brother. Now, when Henry VIII died, this is like when all the conspiracy and drama starts happening. Henry VIII had required a regency council to be in charge of Edward VI because he would be a minor. So Edward VI was 9 years old when he became king. So Henry VIII in his will wrote out, I want this regency council of men, to guide my son to rule the country. And immediately Thomas Seymour's older brother, Edward, starts teaming up with other people saying, well, I think what he really means is he wants me to be the Lord Protector. We need one person in charge because that's just how it needs to be. So you have all this whispering behind closed doors and hallways and stuff. So eventually this Edward Seymour becomes Lord Protector. He's in charge of the king. He is king de facto, I would say. So the most powerful man in England.
So if you're a Game of Thrones fan, he was the hand of the king.
Yes, exactly. And so then you have Thomas, the brother, the uncle to the king, who's sitting back going, all right, it's my turn. What am I going to get? And he gets handed a baronship. And he's like, here, you're going to be the Baron of Sudley. And he's like, all right.
And
right? And okay, I'm going to appease you. Now you're going to take the Earl of Warwick's, or the, he wasn't Earl of Warwick, yeah, but anyway, you don't care about that. You're going to take his title.
I am shockingly caring about everything deeper than I ever thought I would.
Into it.
Okay, so John Dudley, who was then Lord Lisle, was Lord High Admiral. The Lord Protector, Edward Seymour, who was Thomas Seymour's older brother, says, I'm going to take this Lord High Admiral title away from you and give it to my brother, but I'm going to make you Earl of Warwick, which is pretty impressive. That's a pretty good earldom to have. And so Thomas Seymour is now made Lord High Admiral, which should have appeased him. But he was like, oh, man, this really sucks. My brother here's got total ownership of our nephew. And in the past, in history, when a minor king was on the throne and there were uncles, both uncles were given some type of power. One was governor of the king, one was, lord of the realm, or, whatever it may be. And Thomas Seymour didn't get any of that. And so he kind of did whatever he could to get power.
I imagine he's like looking through stained glass windows, right? And he's watching his brother and like pat the king on the head and going, wah, wah, wah.
You're not too far off, to be honest with you. Like, he was doing everything that he could to make his nephew like him. So he would give him money because the Lord Protector was not giving him money to give to his servants or for spending, whatever he wanted it for. He would like keep him locked up in a room, all that kind of stuff. So Thomas is like the cool uncle. He's like, here's some money. I'll give you this. What else do you need? Just let me know. I got you taken care of. Well, he, he's described in so many ways. Like, they describe him as being tall and handsome, and my favorite is a voice that was magnificent, and he dressed well, and he was this eligible bachelor for the time, and everybody seemed to like to be around him, and yet he was a little bit reckless. So he wanted these things, but he didn't necessarily think it through all the way before he acted on stuff. And so King Henry VIII dies. His wife at the time was Catherine Parr. she was very much a Protestant at the time, but people didn't know it because it wasn't okay to be a Protestant queen at that time. And prior to Henry VIII marrying Catherine Parr, she was planning to marry Thomas Seymour.
Uh-oh.
And they had talked about marriage. Henry VIII saw her and, of course, wanted to marry.
In.
Yeah. And what can you do? The king wants to marry you. And she was super religious. And so she was like, well, this is what God wants me to do, so I'm going to do it. Thomas Seymour ended up getting sent off, abroad on embassies. Whether Henry VIII did that on purpose to get rid of his competition, we don't know for certain. But after he died, it wasn't long after that Thomas Seymour secretly married her, which was a big no-no, because she could have been pregnant with Henry VIII's child, and it was too soon, and you need permission. And so he went in and secretly married her. And then after the fact, they were like, oh, crap, what do we do now? We don't have anybody's permission. We can't go public with this. So Catherine Parr tells Thomas, I need you to go to your nephew, the king, and somehow get him to give permission for us to marry. And so Thomas Seymour goes to Edward VI's servant, John Fowler, and says, hey, the next time you talk to the king, will you ask him who he'd recommend that I marry? And the king says to John Fowler, well, I think he should marry Anne of Cleves, which was Henry VIII's fourth wife, the one that he was only married to for like 6 months, and he didn't like her. She was the German. And then he said, oh, no, wait a minute. No, I want him to marry the Lady Mary to change her opinion. So the Lady Mary would be Bloody Mary, Mary the First. Very, very Catholic. And of course, this country was now Protestant under Edward VI. And when Thomas Seymour was told of this, that these were the two women that he wanted him to marry, he laughed. He was like, oh, that's just like ridiculous. You want me to marry these two old ladies?
No.
What are they going to do for me? So eventually he said, well, ask him, what he thinks about Catherine Parr. And he ended up giving the permission. Of course, they were already married, but then it was all approved and okay, and the Lord Protector wasn't very happy about it. And then Thomas went on to try to find ways to take control of the king in one way or another so that he could have more power to somehow dethrone his older brother. And that's probably the quickest way for me to tell that story. But eventually he ended up getting executed in a very unfair way. He didn't get a trial. All these charges were thrown against him. People were brought to the tower and were interrogated. And of course, that was terrifying. You get brought to the tower, you're going to be tortured. So you're going to say whatever it takes to get yourself out of there. So these people were, in my opinion, making up stories about him or exaggerating things that may have happened.
And that's essentially the historical record that we have, is basically what people were saying under duress to say negative things about this guy.
Right, exactly. And so I've been working a lot lately on looking at the 33 articles that were against Thomas Seymour and breaking them apart piece by piece and figuring out what may be true and what's not. Of course, I don't know for certain. So a lot of this is just my opinion on it. But I feel like he wasn't necessarily guilty of everything that they've made him out to be. So I've taken it upon myself to become his voice in one way or another.
That's really cool.
That is very, very neat. And how's the process of writing a book?
First of all, I never in a million years would have thought I would write a book. I didn't think I'd ever do a podcast. I didn't ever think I'd do a blog. So when I thought about doing a book, I went, I don't even know where to begin. And my husband said, well, you need to start with, start with a timeline, do an outline, start with that way. And I always do things my own way. He gives me advice and I always do the opposite and it drives him crazy. And so I started making an outline. I was like, this sucks. I'm not doing it this way because I have ideas in my head and I just want to get them out. And so I try to write every day. I'm not saying that I do because there are just some days where I'm not inspired to write and I'm just not feeling it. But I'm trying really hard with the story that I'm writing about him to include as much fact as possible and fill in the blanks where I can. So Thomas Seymour didn't marry until he was 40. I already said he was a good-looking guy. He had a magnificent voice. You're like, why wasn't he married yet? And people will say, well, it was because he was looking for a rich widow. Well, yeah, maybe he was, but still, it shouldn't have taken him that long.
Well, even at that time, though, I mean, I'm assuming, obviously, because men held 100% of the power.
Yeah.
I mean, he could probably have his fun whenever he wanted to.
Right.
And that the choice of marriage was, like you're saying, much more of a political and economic and strategic decision. And he never found the opening that seemed to work for him.
I mean, is there a chance that perhaps he preferred the company of gentlemen?
That has been brought up. It's definitely a possibility. I don't take that stance in my book. I try to answer that question, like, why did it take him so long to get married, by introducing females. I don't want to give too much away.
No,
yeah.
You got to buy this book.
Spoiler alert.
Right? You don't get all the nuts for free, okay?
But remember we were talking earlier about smut?
Yeah. Oh, is there some smut stuff in here?
There might be.
Excellent.
I've come to realize I'm pretty good at writing this.
Hey, that's what all those Harlequin romance novels was for.
Right?
Are there some moments like when you're done, you're like, oh, God, I'm sweating from
So
the forehead a lot.
the cover of this going to be a shirtless
like
Tom,
Fabio.
like just because these guys always are like missing their shirts. Like I don't know what happens to their shirts.
I-
At that
Right?
time, shirts were very rare.
They were, yeah.
Very rare, historically.
Very rare.
My mother and I both read the book Wicked at the same time. We
okay.
had this little book club, and Wicked is the story of the Wicked Witch of the West before she became the Wicked Witch of the West, and how she met Glinda in college, and how, she was actually all about animal rights. And she's someone who has a horrible, horrible story that everyone knows, but it turns out Gregory Maguire, the guy who wrote it, shows that no, this is 100% a misunderstanding, and this was somebody who they made up all these stories about.
Right.
The musical is wonderful. But so we're both reading this, and we get to a chapter, and there's a chapter where they vividly describe how when she bathed, she would have to bathe with oil because water would melt her.
Oh.
And the man that she's like a lover of is describing like while he's watching her and like her green skin, and
Right.
I was like, I'm reading it and I'm like, oh God, okay, well, here we go.
Mom's
And,
reading this too.
Yeah, and I'm like, my mom is in the other room reading this chapter at the same time. So we get to the end, and my mom goes, well, this was a good one. I think that's enough of a discussion for this chapter. Which is unheard of because my mom was as ballsy and out
That's
there.
awesome.
She was baughty.
Yeah, I think your mom. In my head, I would have imagined her just going into detail,
Like, did you hear this about the tits?
Duckies.
the duckies,
Come on.
Duckies.
the duckies,
How can I forget that already?
them duckies.
But it's one of those things where, I mean, people, especially now because of the television show and
Yeah.
the other writing, people would expect that. If you wrote a book that was,
Get to the good stuff.
like for a fifth grader, I don't think people would buy that. They'd be like, no, nuh-uh.
Right. Well, and like I said, I found out I'm pretty good at writing these scenes, but I have to control myself a little bit because I don't want the whole book to become that. So it's finding a balance. Like, okay, this time I'm going all the way. This time I'm only going to tease it a little bit and trying to figure out where that balance is, or when is it going too far.
Tudors After Dark.
Right?
Yeah.
Maybe that's a new podcast.
Listen, I would totally listen to that show. Here, we just imagine what the sex must have been like. Each wife, and then we break it down, positions and sounds, and what would have been allowed at the time. And
Okay, so yeah, let's get real for just a second here about sex in the time of the
Wow.
Tudors, okay?
All right.
People stunk,
Right.
right? So, like, is it really that enjoyable? Like, if you're just a big, sweaty, gross, smelly mess?
Well,
and is it true
Like-
that if you were king, you had a servant whose job was to catch your ejaculate when you'd masturbate?
isn't that just all nasty?
That was in
He
the
had
TV show.
He had somebody who wiped his butt too.
Oh my
so-
goodness!
Yeah. So it was a
Ugh.
different time, but I don't.
Yeah, I'd say so.
I don't
Yeah.
think that people necessarily smelled as bad as we think they did. I did a podcast on Tudor life and did a little segment on that talked about hygiene.
Okay.
They were very cognizant about being dirty.
Sure.
They
Like
wore,
the kings or everybody?
I would say definitely the people that were at court.
Okay.
Maybe not the common people, but the people at court, they would clean themselves with cloth. So they would take this piece of cloth and they would basically rub their skin until it turned red. And that, like scrubbing your armpits, you would do that. And that's kind of what they did to clean themselves. There's an author and historian by the name of Ruth Goodman who lived like a Tudor for 30 days. Oh. And she basically, she wore the linen underneath her clothes because that's what they did. They would just change out the linen when it got sweaty. She wore the linen under her clothes. She wore the socks like they did. She cleaned herself the way that they did. And she said that, at the end, people didn't really notice. So what they were doing was working. It's just not what we accept today as cleanliness.
Yuck.
But they use like rose water and stuff as perfume, and they brush their teeth, but not like we brush our teeth.
Right.
What would they have even used? I mean, just water in their finger?
Sometimes they would just use cloth with it too. During the time of Queen Elizabeth, there are stories told that there was a little concoction made with sugar that they used to clean their teeth, which later on she had horrible teeth, which would explain you're cleaning your teeth with sugar.
I just was on a webpage about the barbaric ways we handled dentistry and orthodontia at the beginning. Ugh. And one of the things they said is in early orthodontia, they used to drill a hole through your tooth and then they would braid wire in and out of your teeth.
Oh my gosh.
And they showed some pictures of some bodies that they've found.
I just got the shivers.
And it is horrific.
Well, and that was a time period, I would assume, where if you got a toothache, it's like, well, let's see if you die tomorrow.
Right.
Because there's really nothing we can do.
Yeah.
We think it's evil spirits.
Right?
That's the best we can do.
We're going to bleed you now because your humors are off. That's just insane.
We spoke earlier about, the TV show The Tudors, bringing the popularity of them up. I'm also curious about fictional fantasy shows like Game of Thrones, which draw a ton of inspiration from history.
Yeah.
The War of the Roses is big, The Tudors. It's weird that Natalie Dormer plays Anne Boleyn on The Tudors and then basically plays the Anne Boleyn analog
I love it.
on Game of Thrones, which shout out to Natalie. If you want to get married, let me know. It's totally cool. If you play your cards right, you could totally have me, Natalie.
I hear she has Pretty Duckies.
I bet she, yeah.
You don't watch Game of Thrones?
Dem Duckies.
No, I do.
Dem Duckies are so good.
They're always well lit.
Yeah. So have you noticed, do you think a lot of the popularity of these historical events is because of fictional shows that draw their inspiration from history? Does that play into it a lot?
I think so, definitely. Because you see an insurgence of people, especially with Facebook now, when these new programs come out, even TV shows, a series about this, people go crazy, and all of a sudden you see an influx of new people coming, let's say, to my Facebook page, having all these questions about things. And it's obviously not just the Tudors. There's that TV show Versailles. I don't know if you guys have seen that at all.
I've heard about it.
No, I haven't seen
that
that
one. That one's a little bit racy too.
Oh, check that one out.
Yeah, there's a lot of skin.
So nobody's making a PG-rated story.
Well, I mean, technically, the Vikings don't show any nudity in theirs. Like, they are about as violent as you can get on,
broadcast
it's a cable channel. It's a
History Channel,
right? So they get really violent, and they go right to the edge of what you can and can't show.
Interesting.
But that is also a show. We had Tim Jorgensen on a number of podcasts back, and he's really into Viking culture, and he's a historian along those lines. And we don't know much about the Vikings, actually. They weren't people who wrote things down. So there's a lot of fill in the gap there.
Right.
And so that happened with the show The Vikings. But the Tudor Dynasty, I mean, even though you have to fill in the gaps, it seems that because of how big Henry VIII was, is there like a large amount of source material to go to compared to other things at that time? Or is it as spare as everything else?
As far as the Tudor Dynasty in general, there is a lot. Okay. And of course, prior to that, there's not going to be as much because things just get lost over time. But the Tudor Dynasty, there is a ton of primary resources available if you look in the right places. That was something that I kind of learned as I went along. Thankfully, I've made friends on social media and through different groups that have helped me.
What qualifies as a primary source?
Something, I would say it's more of a contemporary source. So if it existed during their lifetime.
Got it.
So if you can find that, that's better than grabbing a secondary source out of a book. That can be a little bit trickier. I started out doing secondary sources because I didn't really understand it all. And then I had a friend say, well, you just need to look at the back of these books that you're reading for primary sources and just start there. And that's kind of when I started. And there is so much available on the internet right now for free when it comes to contemporary sources. Google Books, oh my God, people don't know. There's so much available there.
Do you feel like a detective?
I do. I love it. It's like doing genealogy. It's a mystery. You're trying to solve something.
That's so cool.
And when you find it, it's great. Like I spent 4 hours the other night looking for one specific quote that Thomas Seymour said. 4 hours just combing through all of these things, going cross-eyed. And of course, I didn't find it till the next day when I tried to look fresh again. But yeah, there's so much available.
Do you have like the wall then with like the ropes of
strings,
string
yeah.
connecting
Right?
things?
I would love to have that. I am obsessed with books. Like people are addicted to things. I'm addicted to books. And
As far as
buying
addictions
books,
go, that's a
right?
pretty healthy one.
Well, I don't know how my husband feels about it. 'Cause he's like, you got another book? I'm like, well, the business paid for it. So he was nice enough to go out and buy me a huge bookcase, which now is like overflowing. And when I first got it, there was room for tons of stuff. But I really like to hold a physical book in my hands. And if I want to research something, it's like going to the library for me. I walk up to my bookshelf, I grab it out, I find the page, I can reference it.
That's so
Just
cool.
love it.
I know that a lot of people nowadays are missing physical books, and you know what I miss is, so I worked at a video store for a while, and I found so many great movies from just walking the shelves, and you don't get that with an ebook.
No.
Your Kindle might say, hey, you like this, so here's some other things.
Right.
But those are the publishers that they're paying to put them, right there. They're not doing
Exactly.
a good job of saying, hey, you read this, here's 70 other random titles
Yeah.
for you. You might enjoy one of them.
Yeah.
I
So-
love to read, but to buy a book for me, I'm now sort of at the point that either I have to have an overwhelming interest in the subject matter to want to buy it for good, or the book as an object has to be something beautiful as well. Mm-hmm. So I mean, I'll read books, and I might buy them just to have it so I can read it, but then I won't keep it. I'll find someone else who wants to read it and go, it's yours now. I got one. I'm never going to read it again.
That's normal.
for the
You're
most part.
normal. I'm not.
So, but I mean, I also
She's hoarding these
I
things.
but I am hoarding comic books, I mean, I'm
Right.
hoarding cats, right? I've got all sorts of stuff to hoard. But yeah, even though I'm a electronic millennial, having a physical book in front of me is far preferable to having to read off of a screen.
That's how I feel too. Although the benefit of Kindle is you can search for things.
Yep.
Got it.
That's the benefit. But I love my book. I've even started collecting old prints.
Have you thought about then just having two versions, one on a Kindle and one physically, so you can do the search quickly? But
I have considered it.
Okay.
And to be honest, I have gotten to the point where I've bought two of the same book by accident. I went out the other night and went to Barnes & Noble because that's like my crack. I go into Barnes & Noble like, oh, and I walk in, I found this book. I'm like, this one, I'm pretty sure I don't have this. And I go home, I was like, oh, yep, I do.
that's the difference for me with comic books is there are a few issues that I repeatedly buy them whenever I find them.
Oh, sure.
Because I like them. So Spawn
Trying to
number
own the market.
Spawn number 8, I have about 10 copies of that. And I have a
Wow.
rule that whenever I find it, I buy it. Just because I love that issue
That's
so
my
much.
rule too.
Is that what it is?
Did you ever go to half price books in the Twin Cities or any
I
of those
haven't
places?
been there, but
Oh, they are amazing.
I've been wanting to go to, is it BDS Books here in town?
Books at a Fifth?
No,
On
she's
First Ave.
on First Avenue. He used to be downtown
Oh,
on Broadway.
yeah.
And his place is crazy because there's really no organizational structure in there, but he knows where everything is.
Right. I sent him a message on Facebook and I said, I'm looking for books on the Tudor era in England. And he's like, well, I'm not really sure what that entails, but here are some of the ones that I have. And I do have a whole biography section for England. And I went, oh my gosh, I really need to get there.
Yeah.
Like,
This is a pretty interesting place. Yeah, and then books at a 3rd or a 5th,
Fifth, I
which
think.
is in the same strip mall that Hornbacher's on 13th Avenue.
Yeah.
is.
Oh.
The Village West.
Yeah, there you go.
I didn't know. Oh,
Yeah.
no, this was,
And-
you shouldn't have told me that.
And Books at a Fifth actually buys books.
Yeah, you can
Really?
get
I'm not
credit.
selling
Yeah.
my books.
You can get
so
credit for books that you turn in, though. Yeah.
Yeah. So, for example, after my mom passed and I cleaned out her bookshelves, there were a bunch of books on stuff that I just didn't need. I
No
don't
interest.
need I don't need these craft books.
Cooking with
Or-
Sally Jesse Raphael.
Right, exactly.
Right?
Oh, and some of it was super dated. A lot of magenta colors. And so I brought in these 4 big Hornbachers boxes and I said, hey, listen, what can I do? And they're like, well, give us a call in a week. And so they're like, you can have $400 worth of credit to the store.
Wow.
And I was like, yeah.
That would be so nice.
It was great. But I never leave half-price books in the cities without a couple of books under my arms because the price is amazing for some of the stuff that I enjoy. And what I really like is there's 4 locations. So you go to one and then you go to the next one and you're like, oh, they've got this book here and they didn't have it at the other one.
That would be, yeah, it's probably, I think my stepdaughter bought me some books from there. I wish we had one of those in Fargo. That would be so nice.
Would that be nice?
Oh my gosh.
I also do a lot of book buying on Amazon.
I do too.
And I love when people ship their books to Amazon and have fulfillment by Amazon because then I can use my Prime for it.
Right?
Yeah.
See, the problem, I have the Amazon app on my phone, which makes it a little too easy for me to go, beep, beep, boop, done. There's 6 books coming. I mean, there was a time where I was ordering about 8 books a month.
Wow.
And there's no way I was reading 8 books a month, but I was just building my collection. And I've gone to Savers before in their book section and found Tudor stuff there.
Some great little gems.
Yeah. I mean, why pay full price? I'll get the used ones on Amazon too and paid $2.50 for it and wait a little bit longer for shipping. I use Biblio now a lot.
Yeah? You like that?
I like it because that's where I get my I call them my antique books from the Tudor period. So the oldest one I found so far was from 1861.
Really?
So I have about, I want to say 10 to 12 vintage Tudor books right now.
I mean, is it an actual like print book or is it a handwritten book?
It's oh God, I wish it was a handwritten book, but it's a printed book. But like old time printing.
Yeah.
Like I love
like
them.
printing press printing.
Right? And then you open it and you smell it and it just smells old.
Yeah.
You know, and they sit in my shelf and I stare at them and occasionally I'll take them out and reference them, but it's like my new thing now. I'm going to collect these old books.
So briefly before you go, because I think first and foremost, if you're interested in this conversation about the Tudors, go check out your podcast. How many episodes deep are you? Do you know? It's a lot.
You know, I started out numbering them and then stopped because I realized I was going all over the place. Like, I'm going to go this, I'm going to do this and do this. And then all of a sudden I strayed and I went, okay, that's not going to work. So I think I have over 30.
Wow.
But I don't do them as often as you do. I started in February of 2017. So I try to do them about twice a month now. They're very time consuming.
They are time consuming because you're putting in a lot of research. We just sit
my
down
gosh.
and be like, what are we going to talk about?
Rebecca
you
and I,
guys?
before we started today, were comparing and contrasting like production styles, and this will be episode 50 for us.
That's awesome.
Right, which we wanted to have a special guest for 50, and I'm so glad JJ talked to you.
But Tom Szymanski turned us down, so
thanks.
I'm just kidding.
You know what though? I prefer Rebecca to Tom Szymanski. What is he going to talk about? Oh, I guess I
It's
used to
not
read.
hot enough.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So-
Got a drink?
So Tudors Dynasty, I can't tell you enough great things about it. I became a listener. My sister became a
thank you.
listener. And you must, I imagine your listenership is global. People are
It is.
all over the place.
It's weird. You know, like I'll do a shout out on Facebook and I'll say, roll call, tell me where you're from. And I'll get people from Australia, England, Norway, Peru, like China. You name it. There are people there who are listening to this and it blows my mind.
If we did that, it'd be North Dakota, Minnesota, North Dakota, Montreal, North Dakota. Someone from Mexico downloaded an episode.
Well,
we have a
that's
Mexican
cool.
listener.
Hola, everyone.
Hola.
So another interesting thing about your life, this has nothing to do with the Tudors, but so your husband has been ghost hunting for years, and I understand that there's a ghost in your own home that you don't like to talk about.
I don't.
So let's talk about it.
Yep.
So we moved into our house 11 years ago. When we were house hunting, my husband said, "Oh, I hope we find a house that has a ghost." And I said, "Bite your tongue, okay? Because I don't want to live in a house with a ghost." So one of the first nights that we're in the house, he sees a kid. It wasn't our kid. He sees a kid. And from that point on, it has been like nonstop with this gray lady. He calls her. There's she appears in gray, basically. It's just in color overall. And so the joke in the house is everything is the gray lady. The gray lady did it. What was that noise? Oh, it was the gray lady. He sees her. I've only seen out of the corner of my eye or a reflection in glass or something. I've seen things, but it freaks me out. Do I believe that there's a ghost in our house? More than likely, yes. Because if he's seeing something and our son saw things when he was younger, then there's something. But I had a friend who said, if it scares you, you need to tell them not to show themselves to you. So I made a point one day, went into our bathroom, which is like the hub, the epicenter where they come and go, it seems like. And I sat down there and I said, please do not show yourself to me or my son because it frightens me. You can stay here, but I just don't want to see you. And so
Maybe she's a fan of the podcast.
this was before the podcast, but
Maybe she's a fan now.
Yeah, maybe.
This house was pretty
But-
boring. Then this
By the
lady
way-
started talking about my friends, the Tudors.
Gray Lady, if you could please download JJ Meets World, add it to whatever you're consuming
We
your
love
podcast
all of
on.
our fans, both alive and spectral.
Yes.
But we had who was it? There were some ghost hunter type people in Fargo came in and did a thing in our house when my husband was still on the radio. They did it for the show, and we stayed out in the tent that night because they had to turn off all the power in the house because they didn't want any interference. And so my son and I stayed outside in the tent while my husband Troy and his friend Terry and these ghost hunters were in the house doing all their little readings and stuff. And they had cameras set up and they put a ball in the hallway. And of course the ball moved. And I went in for a little bit with one of those, the EMP readers or EVP, I don't know, whatever they're called. And the little lights light up when something spiritual is near. And I was holding it and I was making some joke about how there wasn't anything in there. And all of a sudden the thing went crazy and I was out.
Yep.
I was like, I'm done. That's
Peace out.
enough. But the only thing I really physically experienced was when we first moved in. I was sleeping in our bed, and it was the summer, and I had my feet sticking out of the end of the blanket. And in the middle of the night, I felt somebody run their finger up the bottom of my foot. And that freaked me out. To this day, I don't sleep with my foot outside the blanket because I'm terrified that's going to happen again.
Oh, snap.
Right.
Oh.
Yeah.
That gives me the willies.
But our son, he was 3 when we first moved in, and he was freaked out one night when I was putting him to bed, and he said he was afraid of the black people in the house. And I was like, there's nobody in the house, buddy. He's like, no, they're here, or they were here. And I was like, well, where are they now? And he's like, well, they're at Jerry's house. And he didn't know anybody by the name of Jerry, and he was 3. Like, where did he just come up with that name? And I was like, well, do they have a name? And he's like, their names are James and James. And we thought about it a lot, and my husband was in the living room, overheard the conversation. I came out and gave him this look like, oh, God, something not good is happening. Well, when these investigators came to investigate our house, they were in the basement, and they were doing recordings, talking, what's your name? Is there anything I can help you with? Whatever. And one of them said their name was James in a British accent, too.
Ooh.
Right? So Psychic Tiffany, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Psychic Tiffany. She did a reading over the phone with my husband years ago, and she said our bathroom in the basement is a portal. They come and go from it because that's where all the elements come together, earth and water and whatever. I don't understand it all. But apparently our basement bathroom is where the spirits enter and leave.
So if you go to Rebecca's house for a dinner party,
That explains Captain Planet. The 5 kids created a portal, and Captain Planet is a specter that comes through a portal because it's earth and fire and wind and water and heart.
You lost me.
I mean, I see
don't
where
know
you're,
what you're
I
talking
see
about.
where you're. You don't know what Captain Planet is?
No, I don't.
Oh wow.
Sorry.
Oh. Well, listen, you're obviously not listening to the Tudors Dynasty podcast. This is coming soon from the JJ Meets World podcast network.
I'm just happy that Captain Planet makes sense now.
Yeah.
It's all coming together.
It's like,
Oh, he's a
why
ghost.
do these 5 things? Oh, he's a ghost. It's a portal. Okay.
there you
Got
go.
it. Got it.
Yeah.
What you should be really worried about is why did that monkey never poop? That kid's monkey. Heart. What's his name?
Well, they don't show you a 24/7 feed of his life, JJ.
You're following for quite a long time.
I'm trying to remember any
And also, how was he able to get-
character
Who
that we
poops?
ever watched poop ever. When did we ever
Plenty of
see
them.
that?
There's plenty of them.
I don't remember the Ninja Turtles pooping once.
How about South Park?
I guess that's
Say
true.
true.
That's
Yeah.
true.
Is that weird? I knew that.
No, not at all.
I am sure Family Guy. I know The Simpsons.
It's weird that you know South Park but not Captain Planet. That's the thing that's weird to me.
South Park was big when my husband and I first started dating. Isn't
Okay.
that sad? We used to watch it together.
That's not
oh
sad.
boy, what a
That-
what a
why is that sad?
Lothario.
That and Midnight Love. Do you guys remember Midnight
No.
Love?
Yes.
Midnight Love. It's like on BET. That was our jam back then.
Yeah, it was great seeing you in class today. Want to come
watch
over and
some
watch the new
Midnight
South Park episode? I think Kenny might not die this time, but we'll see. Sure. I don't know how that went, but
Yeah, definitely not like that. But
that's some historical revisionism. I don't know what happened, so I have to fill in the gaps.
Right.
You're using a secondary source. Rebecca Larson, the woman behind the Tudors Dynasty podcast and soon-to-be book as well, and website.
Right.
If people want to find you, how do they find you?
Well, you can go to tudorsdynasty.com. If you're not familiar, it's TUDORS, dynasty.com. Facebook, my Facebook page is Tudors Dynasty. I'm on there the most. That seems to be where everybody congregates. So come check it out there.
Why are buildings called Tudors? Does it have to do with the style of that time?
Yes.
Or are they like built like for head lopping?
It was the style of the time.
Yeah. But why just the Tudors, right? Like did Henry VIII come out here and be like, more buttresses, more buttresses? So we'll save that question for the next time you're on the podcast.
Good. Gives me time to research it.
Good. I'm glad. Thank you very much, Rebecca.
Thank you so much for having me.
JJ Meets World.
Well, that does it for this episode. Thank you so much for joining us on our podcast journey, everyone. Here's the deal. I ask you every week for some money, and this week is no different. You can go to patreon.com/JJMeetsWorld, and a couple of dollars goes a long way. If you want to make a one-time donation, we appreciate that. If you want to make an ongoing donation, that is even better. We're asking you to give up a cup of coffee a month. That's it to support JJ Meets World. We got to pay for all sorts of stuff like kibble. We're eating kibble, okay? And we would love to eat some real meat, because the dogs are all eating meat and we are eating the dog's kibble. Patreon.com/JJMeetsWorld. And hey, while you're on the internet, why don't you cruise over to moonbasemaria.com. That is the internet home of my producer extraordinaire, Tucker Lucas. There's all sorts of great stuff there. Plus, I believe there's some contact info if you want to get a hold of him through a chain. Don't expect him to get back to you right away, because he's a very busy man with many things to do, such as trimming his beard. If you want to get a hold of me, your host with the most, you cruise over to linebenders.com, which has successfully been under construction for 7 years. But you can find my contact info if you want to shoot me a line. Let me know about something that you're working on that I need to take into. And of course, if you want to download this podcast on the regular, subscribe to it. You can subscribe on iTunes or Spotify, wherever you consume the podcast that you love. And why not give us a great rating while you are at it? And as we finish up today's episode, I think we should take a real key from the Tudors here and ask ourselves the important question, which is, how many wives do you think I'm going to have? 7.